Hi everyone, Tony Tonkin here from the Child Protection Party. Now, I'm not too sure whether this is going through to Facebook at the moment. I know that it's definitely going through to YouTube. And if you're not receiving it on Facebook, not much I can do about that, because Facebook decided that in all their wisdom, they're going to change the way that we live stream. And so they've given me this new interface, whatever. I've attempted to try it, but it's not telling me that it's not going through. So I believe that, or someone just sent me a note, so clearly it must be. So welcome for those of you that are watching me on YouTube. Glad that you could be with me. I'm going to talk about a topic which I've been thinking about over the last few days, which I think should concern all of us, and that is issues in relation to defunding the child protection system. Now, I know in the US over the last 2 years, they've been talking about defunding police as if that is a good thing, because the police in themselves are somewhat corrupt, or at least they are when it comes to African Americans. And so I've been thinking about this notion about what would happen if we actually defunded the child protection system. Is it a good or a bad thing to think about whether or not we should reallocate the money that is used for the child protection system in other areas that are more beneficial to kids? Now, it creates a bit of a dilemma because, and I'd really be interested in your feedback, even though I can't quite see it on my page at the moment. But if you leave comments, I'll get back to those comments later on and respond to them. But the key issue, I think, is that if we take money out of the child protection system, what does that leave us? Well, when I was thinking about this, I remembered that 85% of cases that go to the child protection system are around neglect. And I was thinking about what is this neglect? And in my experience, the neglect is often around domestic violence, for example, being in the home, the children being affected and impacted by that, clearly, not just that, but also the person who is the victim of the domestic violence. Also, there is emotional and psychological neglect, and there's certainly some neglect in relation to the children not being provided adequately for in terms of food and in regard to clothing and so forth. So the kids are unkept. Now, there are certain parents in this world who do neglect their children. There's no disputing that. And there probably needs to be a system in place that cares for those children. And also there needs to be a system that cares for children who lose their parents for other reasons, through death or through illness or through their own mental well-being issues. So there needs to be a system. But the question I'm asking is, what would happen if we defunded this system and we looked to another system that dealt with criminal neglect? Under this system, as we all know, it is about balance of probabilities. So it's about someone making an assessment based on a whole lot of subjective views about a person, which lends itself also to issues around prejudice, about seeing certain people in certain ways, and that brings about decisions which basically are unhelpful, both not only just for the kids but also for the parents and other people in the children's lives. So it is important for us to consider what is it that it would look like if we focused just on criminal neglect. So I thought I'd have a look at what this is in South Australia and what it means, and just read some of these details out to you in relation to criminal neglect in this state, and think about if we were to have a system that was based on prosecuting people for criminal neglect, would that be appropriate? And then when I was reading through this information, I started to think about, well, why isn't it then, if we've got this particular legislation that whereby people can be prosecuted for criminal neglect, why isn't this legislation used more often? Now, I'm not sure as to how often this legislation is used, but in my experience, it's not used often, particularly in terms with many people that we at CPP encounter around neglecting their children. Now, it's 85% of cases are around neglecting kids, and I can guarantee you none of the cases, or very few, that's not true, very few of the cases that I deal with would actually find their way into court. So they're not matters that could be prosecuted in court. Now, that's because maybe the threshold around the notion around criminal neglect is so low that they would not win that case in court. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not too sure about the answers to many of these things, but I'm just putting it to you, what would happen if we did change this system? So if we have a look at the criminal neglect legislation, or this is actually in the Legal Services Commission. So this is criminal neglect is where a person under 16 years or a vulnerable adult dies or suffers harm as a result of an act. The person who, at the time of the act, had a duty of care to the victim may not be charged with an offence under Section 14 of the Criminal Law Consolidation Act. So clear as another act, won't go into all of that right now. Vulnerable adults means a person aged 16 years or above whose ability to protect himself or herself from an unlawful act is significantly impaired through physical disability, cognitive impairment, illness or infirmity. An act includes an omission under a course of conduct, whatever. To be guilty of this offence, a person would have to have had a duty of care to the child or vulnerable adult at the time of the act and been aware, or ought to have been aware, that there was a risk that harm would be caused to the victim by the act, and failed to take responsible action to protect the victim from harm, and the failure was so serious that a criminal penalty is warranted. I think that last bit's really important, where the failure was so serious that a criminal penalty had to be warranted. And I'll just talk about this a little bit further because some issues that are raised in relation to this. So the duty of care of a child. So in our system, the duty of care of a child rests in a number of areas. So it can be with a parent, obviously. It can be with a kinship carer. So it could be someone like a grandparent or an auntie or an uncle who's looking after this child. It can be someone who has been assigned to be responsible for a child through the family court. It can be through other person's guardian, through the children's court. And of course, ultimately, it can be the department themselves. So when we think about this act, we must think about who has control, who has the authority, the guardian of this particular child. Now, in the thing that concerns me the most here when we look at these issues are that whoever holds the government responsible, who are the guardian, according to this act, for neglecting children as they do. So who causes emotional, psychological, physical, and even death of children in our current child protection system? Well, the people that do that actually is the government. And when have they ever been held accountable for the way that they have treated kids? But because according to criminal neglect, they are responsible for any harm that's been impacted upon a child. Now, my guess is that there's some part of the legislation which exonerates them. I'm not too sure where that is. I haven't looked into it in that greater detail. But if anybody here has any ideas about any of that whatsoever, please let me know. So it goes on, though, to say, so harm in these matters, I'll just read this bit here. Harm in these matters means physical or mental harm, whether temporary or permanent, and includes detrimental cause to the physical, mental or emotional well-being or development of a child or vulnerable adult, where temporary or permanent is obviously prominent. So when we're thinking about who causes the most harm to kids that are in care, well, clearly it's the department. Who considers the trauma that's impacted on children and how that eventually impacts their sense of self and well-being and the way that they may choose later on to interact with society? It's the government. And so we've got on one side the government's responsibility for how they manage this and their own areas of criminal neglect and how they view all of that. And then on the other hand, we have parents and other informal carers that might be responsible for the well-being of children. And so we don't see any form of prosecution in regard to criminal neglect right across the board. Very rarely does it happen with regard to the kids. So you all might remember the House of Horrors incident some 7 or 8 years ago, maybe even 10, and the impact that had, because there was a group of adults who clearly criminally neglected those children in that house, and they were prosecuted and they were sentenced. But that is rare, very rare. So let's say we brought back criminal neglect as being the sole reason why we could prosecute parents in this case. So if we did, then clearly, childhood sexual abuse, other forms of assault on children, violence and so on, they would all come under, obviously, this Act, and they'd probably come under other legislation also. So those areas are taken care of in terms of criminality. But in terms of neglect, it seems to be very, very vague. So if we took away the balance of probabilities, which is the current way in which this system works, and we just focused on beyond a reasonable doubt, which meant these people had to go to court, that have lawyers and so forth arguing their case for them, and at the end of the day, a decision would be made as to what penalties could be imposed. And some of those, but not necessarily children being taken away, because that's the responsibility of the Child Protection System and the Department of Child Protection. So how would all of this look then if we chose to defund the Child Protection System? So what we could do is hold on, before I go there, I just want to talk about their, so we also have here, the defendant has duty of care to the victim if they are the parent or guardian or the victim, or whether they have assumed responsibility for the victim's care. Obviously, the government is responsible for the kid's care. Now, the interesting thing here is that the maximum penalty of the child or vulnerable adult dies is the maximum penalty if the child or vulnerable adult dies is imprisonment for life. If any other case, the maximum penalty is imprisonment for 15 years. So the penalties for neglect, the upper end, I guess, of penalties for neglect is quite high. So what I was going to say before was that there are these two sides to it. So if we did away with the balance of probabilities, how could we better use the billions of dollars that is spent on care? And I was thinking that perhaps the reality would be that governments would they then pursue parents who are neglectful, and would they then take them to court? Would that be a good thing? I'd be interested in your ideas around this. Would this be a good thing for families to have, or for parents to have to go to court and fight a criminal matter in relation to neglect, but would it be more difficult for the department to consolidate their version of events if it is about beyond a reasonable doubt? There are many parents out there who I am convinced, had we gone to criminal neglect from a criminal perspective, on the beyond a reasonable doubt, many of those parents would have had their children returned to them. There isn't this quandary of or this plethora of ideas which come from social workers looking at stuff through their own very subjective views. It would be about a court simply making a decision based on the balance of probabilities as to whether the neglect happened in the first place. Would the courts also be interested in what the parent is doing in order to improve their situation so that this neglect, whatever it is, doesn't continue? The court probably would be. But there again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what is the legal justification of that. Because if an act has already happened that has criminal intent, then clearly, I guess that must be the act that must be looked at. But certainly, courts do look at extenuating circumstances, and they do take other issues into account. So I'd be interested to know what you think, because this is something which I think the Child Protection Party needs to take up and consider. This is something we all can work towards thinking about and eventually putting forward some policies and some processes which might be necessary in order for us to consider changing legislation that looks at abolishing the child protection system as it exists right now. That doesn't mean that we get rid of child protection altogether, because clearly there has to be something in place to take care of kids that are harmed and cannot be with their parents at this particular time. So there still needs to be a system, but what that system looks like, I'm not too sure. But we'd be really interested in you telling us what you think that would look like. And I'm just going to, I've got to turn off my sound there. What have I done? So I'll get rid of that. Bear with me, folks. I'm just trying to get hold of my audio around this, and I'll just turn it off over here. So I'm just trying to follow through on any messages anybody had left me, because clearly this has come through on Facebook, so that's pretty damn exciting. And I can't see any specific messages from anybody. So if you do have a view on any of this, could you please let me know, and let us know, because at the Child Protection Party we're about hearing what you have to say and incorporating the best of those ideas into the child protection system as best as we can. So, or into our policies at least. And I'd also like to remind everybody that it's really important to subscribe to CPP. If you've got if you're watching YouTube in particular, could you please subscribe, build up the number of people that are subscribing to us, and also ring the bell so that you'll be notified of other live feeds such as this as they occur in the future. So, and I just want to remind everybody though that on Wednesday night we hold a forum for people to come and have a conversation with us about issues that relate to them and the child protection system in particular. And so join us. You'll see something on our Facebook page that will tell you what it is that we're involved in, what will be the subject for that particular night. We've had some fabulous groups, or some fabulous people I should say, in that particular group. So join with us on Wednesday nights for that forum. It's an opportunity for you to talk about your stuff and to hear what others have to say as a sort of a process to help you manage whatever is happening in your life, and to hear from us as well. And some of the topics are really specific. I think this coming week is about the removal of children at birth. We'd be interested to hear what some of you have to say about that if you've had experiences around any of that. So thanks everybody for being a part of this. Could you please let me know what you think, because I can't get my chat happening here for some reason. It ain't working. So I've had some reactions to the video. Some people following us, which is good. We haven't had heaps of people this time, but lots of people follow later. But can you please subscribe to our YouTube channel? Could you please donate to the Child Protection Party? Or could you join us? That's a form of donation, which is just $12 a month. You'll find the access to that on our Facebook and our webpage. Because if we're going to make any changes at all, we need you to participate. We need you to be able to tell us what it is that you want that's important. We also need to hear your experiences. We've had a wonderful set of interviews that we've done. Darren Perry was the last one. He was fabulous, Indigenous bloke talking about his issues. If you've got issues that you wish to talk to us about as well, please contact us, have a conversation with us about the issues that matter to you. Take care, everybody. Look after yourself, and more importantly, be safe.